Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name's Dawn Leyland and I am one of the archivists at Durham County Record Office. Over the last few years, particularly over the First World War centenary period, I've researched quite a lot of soldiers, most of them in the Durham Light Infantry. So when the Gypsy, Roma, Traveller and Community Cohesion Service approached me and asked if I could research John Cunningham, who came from Hull, I was really interested, not just because he came from a different area, but because of his gypsy background and because I knew quite a bit about the various VC winners from Durham County. I didn't know so much about others, so it was a very exciting opportunity. I'd like to thank them for that, and also Billy and other members of Jack's family for what they've contributed, which has been really helpful in piecing his story together. Jack was born on the 28th of June at Swains Yard, Scunthorpe. Swains Yard is no longer there, but this Ordnance Survey map gives you an idea of the area. He was the eldest son of Charles, a licensed pot hawker, and Mary Ann Cunningham. He had 6 brothers and 1 sister. I've been unable to find them on the census, which is where we'd usually turn to when researching First World War soldiers, which is a shame, as it's a great resource for investigating families, but sadly, gypsies are less reliably recorded on the census than those in static accommodation. It's not a deliberate oversight, it's just that they do tend to get missed. During John's childhood, the family would travel during the summer, including to County Durham and Darlington, where they had relatives, and they would winter in Hull, where they eventually settled more permanently. Hull, in the early 20th century, was entering a time of relative prosperity. It was granted city status in 1897, and although it was still quite poor compared to cities of comparable size, its port, around which much of its wealth was centred, was more productive than in previous decades. The city centre was rebuilt at the turn of the century. In 1904, a memorial to the dead of the Boer War was erected in Paragon Square. The same place would later honour the fallen of the First World War. Not all of this wealth sadly made it down to the workers, and poverty was a continual problem, particularly given the uncertain nature of employment in the shipyards and in the heavy industries that provided most jobs in the city. Because it was a port city, the population was more diverse than elsewhere, with a high proportion of foreign-born people, including German pork butchers, who would doubtless encounter difficulties in the war years, and a sizable Jewish population. Jack's family lived in the Hessel Road area of Hull. This area has changed immensely now, between the Hull Blitz in World War II and various regeneration efforts after the Second World War. It now looks very different. When Jack knew it, the area was very much a busy working class community. Although now based in Hull, the family continued to travel, and John went on to become a hawker like his father. He was described as a good lad, cheery, and he had a pet whippet named Meg. This picture was taken after he won his VC, and the dog pictured here may well be Meg, as she was definitely present in his home when a journalist visited to interview his parents not too long before this photo was taken. At any rate, Jack, who turned 17 in June of 1914, was by all accounts a happy young man who couldn't have anticipated what lay around the corner. The outbreak of war in August of 1914 changed everything for pretty much everybody. Around the country, men rushed to enlist in the armed forces, encouraged to do so by the plethora of adverts, including Kitchener's famous "Your Country Needs You" poster, and influenced by patriotism and by social expectations. A key challenge for the army in these early days was how to organise these new recruits, for while men were certainly needed, Britain had never really had a sizable army, historically relying on its navy, supported by a well-trained body of professional soldiers. These new men were grouped in battalions attached to the existing county regiments. For Hull, the existing county regiment was the East Yorkshire Regiment. Recruits could choose which unit they served with, at least in the beginning of the war. Many chose to serve in their local regiment with other local men. In the First World War, the idea of serving with men from your community was taken a step further with the creation of PALS battalions. The idea behind these was idealistic at heart. Men from a given town or city would serve together, meaning that friends or neighbours would train and fight alongside one another rather than with strangers. It certainly did this, but there was an unfortunate downside. As the war progressed, the realities of trench warfare and the tactics employed meant that battalions could be decimated if they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was one thing if these men's grieving families were spread around the country, quite another if they were all in a single town. And you had cases where a decent proportion of the men from a given street could be wiped out in a single battle. But in 1914, with the country riding high on the expected glory of war and the confidence that it would all be over by Christmas, that was a reality that just wasn't foreseen. 4 PALS battalions were raised in Hull, to be known as the 1st to 4th Hull battalions. 4 battalions from a single city was no mean feat, especially considering that city was a port where many men would more naturally join the Navy or Merchant Navy. And it was also covered by several existing regiments in the East Riding of Yorkshire, as well as the East Yorkshire Regiment. So successful, in fact, was this idea that on the first day of recruiting, the office ran out of attestation forms. Not wanting to slow things down, the attesting officer rushed out to make copies, which was technically illegal. He was supposed to order more copies from the Army office, but I doubt anyone in the Army hierarchy lost much sleep over that. Within a week, the 1st Hull Battalion was at full strength, though the men were yet to be equipped and trained, and the 2nd Hull Battalion began recruiting. Before long, they were on to the 3rd. As they recruited each battalion, officers focused on a particular group or class of men, in the theory that men would be more prepared to join if they knew they were serving alongside others of similar background. The 1st Hull Battalion became known as the Commercials, because they were all clerks and businessmen, office workers. The 2nd Battalion was to be a tradesman's battalion. On the 12th of September, a meeting was held at the Park Street Artillery Barracks, which is pictured there, as it had been decided that the 3rd Battalion was going to be the Sportsman's Battalion. Perhaps it is significant then that Jack was to join up 2 days later. However, this is also where I double-checked my maths. I checked his date of birth, 28th of June, 1897, and the date of enlistment, which is quite clear here on his attestation form, 14th of September, 1914. He was 17 years and 2 months old. That's not unheard of course. Many men did lie about their age to enlist. Unfortunately, in Jack's case, we can't see the age he gave the army because that part of his form has been damaged. The service records from the First World War were destroyed or damaged by fire during the Second World War. Jack's survives, so we have much of it, but we can't tell what age he gave the army. He certainly couldn't have declared his true age, or they wouldn't have allowed him to enlist. He was also sent abroad in December of 1915, at which point he would have been 18 years and 5 months old, which would have broken the army's rule of not sending 18-year-olds overseas. You could join at 18, but you wouldn't be sent into active service until you were 19. So they must have believed he must have lied about his age in order to enlist, and he was certainly not as far underage as many boys. 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds would often try to push their age up, although probably with a bit less success. His service record also tells us that he was posted to the 3rd Hull Battalion, the Sportsmen's Battalion. In December of 1914, the designations would be changed, and they were numbered alongside the rest of the East Yorkshire regiments. So the 3rd Hull Battalion became the 12th Battalion, brackets, 3rd Hull, of the East Yorkshire Regiment. I'm not sure that will have made much difference to Jack, who will have been immersed in his training by that point. Recruits like Jack, who joined during the first months of war, had a different experience from those who came before and after. For one thing, they would often start off being billeted at home, so they would continue to live at home until accommodation could be found for them. There were equipment shortages, so often they would train with wooden rifles. They would begin their training before they had uniforms, as you can see in the example here from our Durham Light Infantry collection. And it was about getting used to army life and army discipline, learning how to take orders, learning what was expected, as well as increasing their physical fitness. The Sportsmen's Battalion was a little different to the other PALS battalions in Hull because it cut across class distinctions. It wasn't just for office workers or for tradesmen, it was for people who had an interest in sport. So it was a bit more diverse than some of the others were. On the 3rd of October, they did a route march through Hull to attract more volunteers. There was no uniforms, so they marched in their civilian clothes with armbands to denote their battalion. When the Hull battalions did finally leave British shores, it wasn't for France, but for Egypt. This isn't actually as unusual as it might at first seem. I'd come across this with quite a few of the soldiers that I'd researched previously. The Suez Canal, as the shortest sea route between Europe and Asia, was a vital strategic asset, and the Ottoman Empire, roughly modern Turkey, was an enemy nation. It must have been an experience for Jack and the other men to travel by ship. Despite living in a port city, fairly few of them would have been on a ship before. If they were those men from Hull who were more used to ship travel, would probably have joined the Navy or Merchant Navy. Not only that, but to disembark from the ship and find themselves in a climate and culture so different from their own, in an age where you can't explore the world by watching videos and seeing things online. They would have had much less idea of what the wider world was like than people do today. In some ways, their lives were not too different from those of any soldiers in wartime. They wrote and received letters. There was a complaint at one point that the commercials, the 1st Battalion, were writing too many letters. They must therefore have too much free time, and their officers should do something about that because it wasn't good for the men to have too much free time. They had at times to cope with insufficient rations, particularly when the men were stationed outside of Port Said. They encountered the perennial problem of lice, which is inevitable when many people live at close quarters. And they spent the Christmas of 1915 here. Then in February of 1916, they were on the move again. The destination wasn't announced, but many of the men had a very good idea where they were going. The trenches of the First World War need almost no introduction. Enough films, books, and exhibitions have been created that many of us have a strong impression of those realities before we look at an archive or open a history book. And the reality was horrific. Mile upon endless mile of barbed wire separating equally endless miles of trenches where soldiers would sometimes for weeks at a time live in the most basic conditions, enduring mud and rats, to say nothing of the constant fear of enemy bombardment and sudden gas attacks. Men were not constantly on the front lines, however. They were rested away from the front lines at regular intervals and might, for example, be billeted in a farmhouse miles from the front where some relaxation might be possible, even if they could not forget where they had come from and ultimately where they would be going back to. As Jack and the other men from Hull arrived on the Western Front, preparations were already beginning for a big offensive to take place at the end of June, what would become known as the Battle of the Somme. On one day, 1st of July 1916, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 men killed, more than on any single day in the history of the British Army. Their gain, 3 square miles of territory. The men from Hull were lucky in that they were in a reserve position, so they weren't part of the initial push. Even so, though their losses and experience couldn't compare with those of the attacking units, they did still sustain some casualties, and they spent the day in trenches under German bombardment, waiting for the order that they were to go over the top and join the attack. That order didn't come, but the wait must have been agonizing. The Battle of the Somme, however, was not fought in a single day. It went on for 5 months, finally ending in November 1916 with the Battle of the Anchor. This was where Jack was to earn his VC. Rather than summarize his actions in my words, I'm going to read out the citation as it was printed in the London Gazette. For most conspicuous bravery and resource during operations. After the enemy's front line had been captured, Private Cunningham proceeded with an a bombing section up a communications trench. Much opposition was encountered, and the rest of the section became casualties. Collecting all the bombs from the casualties, this gallant soldier went on alone. Having expended all his bombs, he returned for a fresh supply and again proceeded to the communication trench, where he met a party of 10 of the enemy. These he killed and cleared the trench up to the enemy line. His conduct throughout the day was magnificent. You may have noticed the date, January of 1917. The reason for the delay is simple: paperwork. There was a whole process involved, and continues to be a whole process involved in granting medals to soldiers that involves various recommendations and agreements by different officers, and this would take time. So there would be some time passed before the man himself was informed, and still longer before it was announced publicly. He was the first man from Hull to be awarded the Victoria Cross, one of only 2 men from the Hull's battalions who would be awarded this honour during the war. And the celebrations began, literally. At this point, the country had been at war for 3 Christmases longer than expected. There was conscription, there were food shortages, and no end in sight. So acts of bravery such as Jack's were celebrated with voracious energy. These men were heroes, and they were treated as such. VC winners became celebrities in their hometowns, and the local papers in Hull were quick to pick up on the news. The Hull Daily Mail devoted most of its 3rd page to Jack's achievement. It includes a photo of him and both his parents, describes his action, and mentions that his home street has become something of a tourist attraction. Edgar Street, a humble thoroughfare near St James Church, Hessel Road, is indeed in the limelight. It has drawn visitors like a kind of magnet. The unnamed journalist also visited Jack's family home, where he spoke to Jack's mother, who had this to say about her son's achievement. "He is a very good lad. We could not have had a better. A strong lad who could do a day's work with anybody. He practically kept this home." A neighbour added, "He had a brave and a bold heart, and he seemed to fear nothing from being a boy." It refers to the family as hawkers, a common term for gypsies in those days, and mentions that the war has inhibited their ability to travel. Jack's father has been working on the docks when he can. Interestingly, Jack is often referred to as a 19-year-old in these articles. I wonder if anyone did the maths and realised that if he was 19 in 1917, he couldn't have been 18 when he enlisted 2.5 years previously. The article also includes a recent letter from Jack to his mother. I got your parcel, all right, but I'm sorry to say everything was spoiled but the cigs. I am very pleased you all enjoyed yourselves this Christmas. We were in the trenches for holidays, but we had a jolly time afterwards and a jolly good dinner with a slop of English beer, which makes everything a bit better. I wish you all at home a happy new year. And I always think it's really nice when you actually get something in the soldier's own words, because service records and army records only tell you so much. It's so revealing to be able to see something that Jack himself wrote. Even though it's fairly routine, it shows, it shows you an insight into who he was. Jack was awarded his Victoria Cross by King George V in a celebratory ceremony at Hyde Park. The Royal Flying Corps, one of the service arms that would eventually make up the RAF, patrolled overhead and a guards brigade provided music. The day was also filmed and footage was recently restored. A number of clips can be found online, but I chose this one as it's very clear considering it was filmed in 1917, and it shows footage of his parents that aren't in the other clips. I'm going to play it now. There isn't any sound. So if you're watching this online, you can't hear sound, there isn't any to hear. Hopefully that is going to work. There. Nope. Why is it doing that? 1 minute. I need to take the presentation down. Nope. Why is it not displaying there? Sorry about this. I'm sure we'll get it resolved in a minute. Does it need to be on it? Is that registered as a different screen? Do you want me to get it to the right slide? Yeah. Right. No, that's still the slide.
Just turn that on.
So it's always fantastic when you can see actual video, especially from a First World War soldier. You can see at the beginning he has a conversation with the king as he's awarded his medal. I understand that he actually talked to the king about his gypsy heritage at that point. The king had been told that Jack was a gypsy, and Jack talked to him about it. Alongside Jack, several other men were awarded VCs. The men were numbered in order to ensure the smooth running of the event, and being perhaps more superstitious than we are today, the number 13 was not used. The 13th man to be presented, however, was one Roland Bradford, VC of the Durham Light Infantry. His exploits are recounted elsewhere, but it's perhaps significant that he was killed by a stray shell a few weeks later. Was this unlucky fate in any way connected to the order of his presentation? We may never know. Jack returned home that evening with his parents. Despite arriving after 1 a.m. on a Sunday morning, he was met by a band and a substantial crowd who hoisted him to shoulder height and carried him to his parents' home. He had a short leave to spend at home, during which he returned to his old school, St. James, in what was surely an inspiring visit for the boys there. Along with his parents and brother Matthew, he was a guest at a meeting of Hull City Council, where he was presented with an illuminated address. The Lord Mayor, Alderman Francis Askew, said this to Cunningham in his public address. It was open to him, as well as to any of the rank and file, not only in the army but in civilian life, by his zeal, industry and determination to achieve higher honours in the future. There was no doubt that this deed would be talked of for many years to come. In June of 1917, while on leave, Jack married Eva Harrison. Naturally, as he was a local hero, still Hull's only VC winner, his wedding attracted great interest. A large crowd gathered outside the registry office, and the happy couple were showered with confetti as they arrived. The ceremony itself was very private, attended only by Jack's brother Matthew, Eva's sister, and a single journalist from the Hull Daily Mail. Naturally, the newspaper coverage featured a description of the bride's outfit. The Hull Daily Mail reported, "The bride wore a pretty frock coat of putty shade. She had silk stockings to match and a hat of a delicate mauve. She wore a spray of white roses." Jack's outfit was not described, other than to say he wore his VC. Jack returned to the war and continued serving until he was wounded. He received the Silver War Badge, which was designed to enable men who had been wounded in less obvious ways to show that they had served in the war and avoid being labelled as a coward or a shirker. Often the badge was accompanied by a King's certificate. Jack was awarded such a badge, his entry is here, but as so often with army records, it doesn't go into a lot of detail, merely listing the men. His name, rank and regimental number and his status as a VC recipient are not news, but it does tell us he was discharged on the 26th of June 1918. Interestingly, his age is given as 23, when he would have been just a month shy of his 21st birthday. This fits with his having lied about his age to enlist, and of course we don't know what age he gave the army, as it was faded on his service record. This is one of the pages on his service record pertaining to his discharge. It gives his name, including the initials VC, of course, his rank and unit. At this point, he is attached to the depot or home base of the East Yorkshire Regiment rather than the 12th Battalion. This often happened with soldiers who had been wounded. Depending on the extent of their injuries, they would either serve behind the lines, freeing a fit man for the front, or, as in Jack's case, be discharged on medical grounds. Jack's medical board was held at the King George Hospital in London under a Lieutenant Colonel Parry. It goes on to give his date of discharge, 26th of June 1918, and lists the various forms that were submitted. We'll skip that part because the end is far more interesting. It tells us the nature of his injury, GSW, or gunshot wound, both legs, and which is basically chest, caused by service. It goes on to describe his service at home, then in the Mediterranean, then in France. Interestingly, his service in France ends on the 16th of April 1918, which is likely when he was evacuated. We don't know precisely when he was wounded, but this helps to narrow it down. It also describes his character. The army often did this on discharge papers in order to help men secure employment afterwards. In this case, it's very complimentary. Jack is described as honest, sober, hardworking, and thoroughly reliable. His military character is described as very good, and of course, his VC speaks for itself. His address on discharge is 72 Walker Street, Hessel Road, Hull. He was also awarded a pension. This page from his service record records the decision to grant him the weekly sum of 27 shillings and sixpence, effective from the 27th of June 1918, his date of discharge. He would also have been entitled to an annuity as a VC holder. When the award was instituted by Queen Victoria, the sum had been £10 per year. The amounts were increased over time, and today VC winners receive an annuity of £10,000. Returning to civilian life was a struggle for many soldiers. Today, veterans are given counselling and help to deal with their experiences. In 1918, no one had heard of post-traumatic stress disorder. Some soldiers were diagnosed with shell shock, a condition with symptoms ranging from panic and the inability to walk or talk to dizziness, amnesia, and hypersensitivity to noise. Some doctors held that it was a physical condition resulting from damage to the brain, which was hardly surprising when artillery shells fired on the Western Front could be heard from British shores. Other doctors favoured a more psychological explanation, and they had a case too, given the horrors of life in the trenches. But shell shock was a label for extreme cases, where the symptoms were inhibiting a soldier's ability to function. Most men were simply discharged at the end of the war, or, if wounded, sent home as soon as their physical condition allowed it. That any man could be expected to return from the trenches and take up civilian life as if nothing had happened seems unthinkable today, yet that was the approach. But it was a different age. People in general were not expected and did not expect to discuss their problems or emotional difficulties. They would probably have been astounded at the idea that this might help them. Stiff upper lip was very much the order of the day, and many men simply never spoke of their experiences, managing their memories and emotions privately as best they could. I think it's important to bear this in mind as we look at his life after the war. Jack and Eva had 2 children. The first, Annie, born in the summer of 1919, sadly died a few months later. The couple went on to have another child, John, in the following year. After that, it seems their marriage broke down. Eva Cunningham was granted a separation order, and Jack was ordered to pay her regular maintenance. He was later in court for failing to make these payments and for other minor offences. Clearly, he was a very troubled man. It's at this point that I came across an unexpected story. When I was looking through Jack's service record, I came across this sheet, dated 1922, and containing a report that a Corporal J. Cunningham, VC, of the King's Own Royal Regiment in Lancaster, was requesting that, as a VC holder, he should be given a staff job and not go on parade. Well, there was a Corporal John Cunningham, an Irishman, awarded the VC in 1917, but it wasn't him because he died of wounds soon after receiving his VC. Clearly, someone in the army had smelled a rat, because there was also a letter from the officer in charge of records at York to the commanding officer at Lancaster. He says, with reference to our telephonic conversation of this morning regarding number 13-1221, Private John Cunningham, VC, late of the East Yorkshire Regiment, I have to inform you that the man called this office, and I verified that he was the man who served in the East Yorkshire Regiment and was awarded the Victoria Cross for gallantry during the operations in France. Consequently, I append below full particulars in respect of him to enable you to deal with the man now serving in the depot under your command, purporting to be John Cunningham, VC, of the East Yorkshire Regiment. Well, there's no record as to how the impostor was dealt with, but given the high regard in which VC winners were held and the fact that many of the men around him would have had first-hand experience of the trenches, I think it's safe to say that he would have seen the error of his ways. Jack Cunningham died on the 21st of February 1941 at his home in Campbell Street, Hull. He was just 43 years old. He's buried in an unmarked grave in Hull's Western Cemetery, but his name and his brothers are on their parents' memorial stone nearby. In November of 2016, 100 years after the action that won Jack his VC, a memorial paving stone was unveiled in his birth town of Scunthorpe. You can see it here at the base of the town's war memorial. This was part of a nationwide commemoration that saw a similar stone laid for every VC won during the First World War, and you can see several of them in Durham. The stone is like the medal itself, understated. It bears only the name, regiment, and the date he won his VC. The act of bravery speaks for itself, needing no additional embellishment. And I think that's an appropriate idea to end with. The idea behind the Victoria Cross from its very inception was that it wouldn't be an ornate medal. Certainly others are prettier and more eye-catching, but they're not. Victoria Crosses are not made of gold or silver. The metal used to make them comes from guns captured during the Crimean War. The focus is on the act that earned the VC, and it should be. Jack's bravery was extraordinary. His life was extraordinary, and I'm very glad to have had the chance to find out about it and to share it with you. Thank you very much. I'd like to finish by asking if there's any questions. You remember everyone has a microphone in front if you want to press the button to turn it on.
Yeah, well, what a lot of people don't mention as well, in the Second World War, Jack Cunningham's son, young John, he was in the Royal Navy and he died on the Hood, the British flagship. It was sunk by the Bismarck. So his actual son made a massive sacrifice as well.
Yes, that must have been, I certainly got from the research, I certainly had the impression that he was very troubled after the war, and I can't even imagine what a blow that must have been to him to lose his only surviving son, or his only son.
Well, he lost his little girl and then he lost his son on the Hood, and it absolutely devastated him. And he died at 43. Yeah.
Yeah, if you'd like to turn your microphone on.
Thank you. Earlier on in your presentation, you said about the census and the Gypsy communities weren't registered on the census. Are they registered now? You know, are they part of the census these days?
Yes, there's much more effort made now to make sure that everyone is recorded on the census. Generally, you find that as the census progressed, so the first one to actually record individual named people was 1841, and you generally find from that point on it becomes better at recording people. By 1901, 1911, a lot of gypsies were being recorded, but others seem to have fallen through the cracks, and unfortunately I wasn't able to find Jack's family. Well, thank you all very much for coming. So I work at the Durham County Record Office. Our email address is record.office@durham.gov.uk. So if you've got any inquiries, please feel free to email us or to get in touch with us through the Gypsy Roma Traveller Liaison Service. Was there any, was anyone, I'm not sure if anyone's going to come up at this point and just finish things off. No? Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Just have a look at my timetable and double check. Yeah, there's now refreshments and an opportunity to ask questions. So I will be hanging around if you've got anything you didn't want to ask in front of other people in the internet. Thank you.